Greetings everyone, Brett here with Hammerhead Model Making, and welcome to episode 2 of the Higher Call series. In this episode, we're going to be mainly concentrating on all of the interior work, scratch building, modifications, and damage to the aircraft. For this kit, I am using the HK Models B-17F, and I will be using a wide range of scratch building techniques, aftermarket, 3D printing to realize my vision here. And one of the really important aspects of this build, at least for me, was making sure that I was staying true to what happened to this aircraft. And so I'll show you a little bit later on, but using the book A Higher Call by Adam Makos as my primary reference here, since there was unfortunately no images of the damaged aircraft after this particular mission, we're going largely off of like firsthand account from the crew and from Franz Stigler as well. And so as such, what I ended up doing was reading through the book multiple times and marking down any time the book mentioned damage to the aircraft. And I ended up writing essentially a multi-page, quick reference guide of all the damage the aircraft sustained, and use that as the guide to then map out the damage on a image of a B-17, so that I could kind of start wrapping my head around what I wanted this to look like. And I was able to reference all of the mentions of damage from the book in my little quick reference guide, and kind of decide what was most important for me to display. I tried to be as accurate as possible to what was described in the book. There are some areas where it's left a little vague as to what that damage actually was, and so I was able to use some creative license to represent the damage as I'm interpreting it. So don't take this as what I'm doing is 100% hard fact. A lot of this is my interpretation of what is written, of accounts given, and it's entirely possible some of the accounts might slightly contradict, but nevertheless, this is kind of how I am interpreting it here. So you can see here, I've got the book here, and I'm highlighting in orange anytime it's any kind of damage is mentioned. The highlighting yellow is anytime a crew member is injured. And so this allowed me to really kind of map out what I wanted to portray. And what was interesting is there's a point later on in the account where Franz Stigler mentions that there was pretty much like no area of the bomber that, so right here, pretty much every foot of the bomber's metal had holes in it somewhere. And so that was kind of like my goal. Was like, okay, this was kind of the vision that I had and what I wanted to portray. So here's kind of my crude drawing based on all of the references in the book, and I've got all the page notes listed here referencing all the specific damage. And while the actual final result doesn't completely match up to my drawing here, it did serve as essentially my guide and how I wanted to do this. And so the first thing that I need to do here with the bomber, with the model, is kind of start sketching out where I want the damage. And that is to help me because with a lot of this model, if I have to represent damage on the exterior, I have to understand what's happening on the interior portion of where that damage is going to be. That way, if I need to represent internal structure, or I need to make sure that it's lining up with accounts by the crew, that it all makes sense. And so what I'm doing here is just roughly outlining what it is that I want to accomplish, what it is I want to represent, and it's going to be my guide throughout this entire build here. And so what I'm hoping that this episode will help you understand is just the sheer massive amount of damage this aircraft sustained, and and just how incredibly crippled it was when Franz Stigler happened upon it. And so one of the first things that I wanted to start out here was the rudder. In the book, it clearly says that the majority of the rudder was shot away. Now, that could mean different things. Like, it could physically mean that a lot of the rudder was just no longer present on the aircraft. Originally, as you can see with my pencil outlining here, I kind of interpreted that as, like, okay, maybe the top half of the rudder was shot away. And I eventually decided to change that up. But what I needed to do was remove the rudder from the fuselage so that I could better work on that damage and have that as a separate element. It would just allow me a little bit more freedom. What I need to do here is do some cleanup with the removed parts, kind of remove the ridges and burrs from the plastic. And I'm using this ceramic blade and knife combo set from Steady. They had sent this out to me to review, and I figured I would use it on this project here. And long story short, for the actual knife itself, as a knife, it does what it says it does as advertised. It cuts, and it cuts really nicely. But as an actual hobby knife, I didn't find it particularly useful or, like better than a standard X-Acto number 11 blade, mainly because you can't do any kind of torsion on it without it snapping. And there's a few times throughout this video you'll see that I actually snapped those ceramic blades, and eventually I just kind of gave up and just went back to the normal number 11 blade because it doesn't break like the ceramic blade does. Although I do like the actual knife handle that Steady provided, but it's really only compatible with their ceramic blade, and so it's kind of an unfortunate loss. So just in case you're ever wondering, the nose compartment was an area that I think HK Models didn't do a fantastic job with. There's some inaccuracies, and now I should point out that there are a lot of different versions and configurations of the B-17 nose, specifically the B-17F nose. It went through a lot of evolution. It went through a lot of field modification, a lot of changes. So what you're going to see, the modifications you're going to see me do here don't necessarily reflect all B-17Fs. This was just as I narrowed down what Ye Olde Pub should look like, it allowed me to narrow down what the interior should look like. And again, there's some interpretation going on here because, again, we don't have direct photographic evidence of what this aircraft looked like. We only have, working off of what contemporaries looked like. And so for a lot of the reference images that I used, I actually went on to the website for the bomb group that the Ye Olde Pub was part of and found images of other B-17Fs from that time period, and based a lot of my references on those images and what those aircraft look like. It stands to reason that they would all be relatively similar. And so to that end, there are a number of modifications that need to be made to the nose just to help elevate the detail a little bit, because one of the main points of damage that Ye Olde Pub suffered was flak hit to the nose compartment. Specifically, the plexiglass nose was heavily damaged and exposed to the air. And as such, I knew that the interior compartment was going to be a little bit more visible than normal. And so I just wanted to make sure that I was representing the detail as best as possible, just because, it would be a little bit more visible than the standard kit would represent. And one of the things that sets the B-17s, especially the early B-17s, apart was the use of wood and plywood for the interior structure, like the floors and stuff. And so there was a lot of areas where I needed to either add like a raised surface to represent that wood, or modify what was there to represent the fact that they had this like plywood and laminate wood laid down. And so what I'm doing here is essentially, creating this laminate wood surface that would go in the front of the nose. And I wanted it to be raised because there's kind of like where the actual bombardier seat would sit, where the seat would be, is kind of a slightly recessed area. And so it was just, in my mind, it was a little bit easier to represent the wood as a raised portion and have, the rest of the compartment be the natural metal, the normal interior structure. And so I'm using some various types and thicknesses of evergreen styrene. I apologize, I don't know offhand what exact thicknesses I used. I tried to keep things relatively on the thin side, just to maintain some semblance of scale thickness here. But like a lot of the scratch building that I do, there is going to be some level of, overscaled. But I think in the cramped confines of the nose compartment, it's going to just, in my opinion, the overscaled, look of things will lend to the detail and allow me to kind of push some contrast a little bit and make that detail pop a little bit more. So right here, I've just getting the quote unquote wood part glued down and contoured to that upslope of the nose floor. But I also had to make sure there was a cutout area for where the bombardier's, all of his instruments were, the salvo options and things like that. And then there's a little platform that the Norden bomb sight would sit on. So I'm using a combination of the kit part and some plastic there to represent that. So I had to make a little cutout there to get that to sit in there, but fortunately that sits in there pretty nicely. One of the other reasons why I wanted to make this modification is because the actual wood floor extends out into the plexiglass nose a little bit farther than the kit part was representing. So there was another modification there. On the rear wall of the nose compartment, there was a lot of areas that were covered in like a canvas cover or like a canvas material to essentially cover up a lot of the back side of like the instrument panel, all the instruments and all the electrical stuff going in there. And so I'm using some really thin plastic here. It's almost, I would say this is like cardstock thickness of plastic. And the reason why I'm using that is because it allows me to maintain the rigidity of plastic and be able to glue the plastic to the kit parts quite easily, but at the same time it allows me to create some easily to deform it and create some waves in it that might give it a somewhat like a heavy canvas material. And I was able to punch through from the opposite side to make it look like there was metal fasteners on there. And so I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. Next up, I'm going to do some modifications to the navigator's table. The kit has these parts on it that are meant to help it glue and register between the fuselage wall and the floor that just aren't present on the actual aircraft. So I removed those. Additionally, I'm removing some electrical components that are on the back wall here that didn't quite match up with my references. But because of the way that part is molded, it left a hole, so I have to kind of blank that over with some of that really thin plastic. But I have other parts that are going to be covering that, so it'll largely become hidden and you won't really notice. So here's just kind of like the simple, dry fitting of these parts just to see how it's all going to fit together. And you can see just how tight and cramped this compartment was. I mean, there's two men in here. You have the navigator, the bombardier, plus there was 3 guns in here. then bomb sight, plus all the ammunition for the guns. Like, it was very tight in there. Another thing I wanted to do was add a little bit more detail to the bombardier's equipment here. The kit detail is pretty sparse and, shallow. Just doesn't really look all that great and doesn't really match up with reference pictures. And so the bombardier's equipment here had multiple gauges and salvo options and switches and toggles, and so I wanted to represent that a little bit better. So I'm drilling out some of that really thin plastic, and that'll kind of help me create some instrument faces, and then I can add some bits of styrene on there to represent switches and whatnot, and just make it. Again, it's not 100% accurate, but I think the detail is a little bit more in line with what the reference pictures show, and just a little bit more added detail there, in my opinion. And again, when it comes to like adding the switch detail and stuff, it'll definitely be out of scale, and it'll look a little chunky, but once it's in there and it's all painted up and it's in this tiny dark little compartment, it allows it to stand out a little bit more and catch your eye without necessarily looking awful. One of the things that I was really keen on portraying here is if you've seen the movie The Memphis Belle from the early 90s, that was like a very informative movie for me as a child growing up, and I wore out my VHS copy of that movie. But there's a moment in there where they have to go around on their bomb run because the target is covered in clouds, and the navigator, in kind of like a moment of frustration, tries to toggle the bombs, and there's this moment where the bombardier and the navigator are kind of fighting over the switch, and there's you have this little cover that protects the switch that you have to push down, and then you can toggle the bombs, and they fight over this, and I really wanted to make sure that I added in that little detail to this bomb. I don't know that was necessarily an accurate because this equipment changed and evolved throughout the life of the B-17, so I don't know if this particular B-17 would have had that specific bomb salvo mechanism, but it was important to me that I represent that, just as kind of like a throwback to my childhood, and that those informative years for me that really solidified why the B-17 is such an iconic aircraft to me, and it was just something that. So this is the actual toggle here, and I have the cover down, and in my mind, they've already been on the bomb run at this point. They're returning home. The cover is down and the switch has been thrown, and so there's a tiny little Easter egg for you. Well, for me, really, that was purely for me and for my enjoyment, was to represent that little mechanical piece. But I'm pretty happy with it. So as you can see, that's how the equipment fits within the fuselage there, and pretty nice. I wanted to add a little bit of detail to the navigator's table here. So the navigator's table would have been a plywood table, and it would have had kind of like an aluminum strip running around the outside edge of it. So that's what I'm doing here, is just getting this glued down. Once I get it glued on and it cures, then I'll trim it down, and it'll look nice. And again, it's one of those absurdly minute details that no one will probably ever pick up on the finished model, but I'm happy it's there. So on a lot of the B-17Fs that I was looking at that had the same nose configuration as Yield Pub, there was this little like rack of equipment right next to the navigator, and I assume it was like windage, equipment and obviously navigation equipment. And so I'm just using a little bit of extra spare brass here to represent that bracket, and then I pulled out some random boxes from my spare bits to put in there to represent that equipment that the navigator would have used to do his job. So this is all being glued on with CA glue, super glue, and because I'm doing, different types of material there. So here I'm doing a little bit more dry fitting, trying to figure out how I want to do the ammo box. There was two different ways that the ammunition was stored for the navigator's gun. There was a version where, and what the kit represents is that the ammunition would sit directly above the navigator's station. So the ammunition would feed into the left side of that cheat gun. A lot of the other versions that I saw, the ammunition was off to the right above the bombardier's equipment, and it would feed into the gun on the right side. And that's ultimately what I chose to represent here. And I saw different versions, but what was neat was I saw this version of like a bracket with two ammo cans in there, and I kind of gravitated towards that. So that's just ultimately what I decided to represent. So I'm just using, so the ammo cans are from the kit, and then I just built a bracket around it out of some of that really thin plastic. I created this little retaining strap, and then that will sit just right there above that first window, and then will feed down into the gun on the right side. Now the kit provides you a couple of seats for the navigator and the bombardier. However, they are not quite correct. So we're going to remove that incorrect back portion, backrest here, and we're going to scratch build a more correct looking backrest for the seat. And so I'm just using a little bit of spare photo etch fret. It's really good idea to hang on to your spare photo etch. You never know when you might need just extra little pieces, but also at the same time just having the extra strips, because it's a good way to get uniform strips of brass in various lengths and widths. And so, for example, I can use this little piece here as the kind of the back bracket of the seat, and then do a new cushion here out of plastic, and then finally just using a little spare doohickey from from my spares bin as the little adjustment piece on the back. So that was pretty much all there was to do for the seat. The larger ammo cans are hollow on the backside, but because you'll be able to see the backside through some of the windows, I had to blank them off with some spare plastic. It's a pretty easy modification to make, and one that will prevent it from looking, just like an empty box there. Now we can start adding some damage to the nose here, and I'm using this grinding bit in my Dremel to thin out the plastic. And something you need to be careful about when you're doing this type of modification to a kit is you can very easily melt the plastic. And by the way, there's an example of how the ceramic blade snaps. Unfortunate. So you want to make sure when you're doing any kind of grinding on plastic, you're using a slow speed setting. You don't want this thing, cranking out at 10,000 RPMs, and you just want to slowly grind away the plastic until it's thin enough that you can easily cut through it. And the way that you can tell that it's thin enough is if you hold the plastic up to the light, you'll be able to see light shining through. And the thinner the plastic, the brighter the light will look. And that's kind of your indication. And once you get the plastic thin enough, it's really easy to cut and to trim and to make it look like damaged and twisted metal. But again, you have to be really careful that you're not over cranking your rotary tool and melting the plastic, because then you just end up having melted plastic. And I've seen other people attempt to do damage with varying degrees of success, but the ones that I think look the least good are the ones that just look like melted plastic, like they took a soldering iron to the plastic and just melted a hole into it. That's just not how thin aluminum reacts to bullet damage, cannon damage, or flak damage. So it's a somewhat time-consuming process, especially when you have an entire B-17 that you have to add damage to. But I promise you that if you take it slow, take it one little piece of damage at a time, and don't melt the plastic, it'll pay off in the long run, hands down. Now, if you look at different artist rendition of Ye Olde Pub, and how the nose was damaged. There's lots of different versions of how it was done. Some of them have like a lot of the canopy blown away. Some of them have the side of it, the bottom of it. I ultimately chose to do the top portion as damaged and exposed. And additionally, you'll see a lot of artwork depicting the nose, like the nose gun configuration, with the two offset guns, similar to how Memphis Belle was. And from what I can tell, and based on all the reference picture from contemporaries from the bomb group, they all had the centerline mounted gun, usually just a single gun. So I saw some that had the twin 50 in the nose, but most of them were a single 50 centerline nose, as opposed to the two kind of off-center 50 caliber mounts. So ultimately, that's the one that I went with, because I felt like it was the more likely option that the pub had. And that's not to downplay the amazing artwork that's out there of the old pub. Just to me, this is what felt to be slightly more accurate. Cutting up a clear part is really difficult because clear plastic tends to be way more brittle than your standard plastic. So you have to really be careful. So I scored the plastic first before going through and trimming it. And that worked out pretty good. I have some 3D printed details here from a friend of mine. He goes by the handle Warhawk In Scale on Instagram. I'll put a link down to his cults page here. But he's done up a set of detail parts for the B-17, and he offers them for free. So I'm gonna link it down below. Check him out. Go support him on Cults. He does some great work here for a lot of like the smaller details, like the rheostats for the heated suits, the oxygen regulators, the little walk-around oxygen bottles, things like that. And he has additional details that I'm going to add into the cockpit here as well. The cockpit is not terribly detailed. I mean, out of the box, it looks pretty good, and especially considering the fact that you really can't see well into the cockpit once it's all, everything is all closed up. But I did want to replace some of the molded in detail with slightly more accurate detail, as I mentioned, from Warhawk In Scale. So he provides the center console, instrument panel, new oxygen bottles for the cockpit. And that requires you have to figure out what you want to do with these sidewalls. Now, again, the sidewalls don't totally accurately represent what the B-17 cockpit area looks like. It should be a little bit more concave and less straight up and down on the back portion of it. So I ended up cutting out and just straight up removing the back portion of the sidewalls, but keeping the actual cockpit portion because those are fairly accurate. And in just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to my father, and he's going to give you a little bit of history on the pilot, Charlie Brown.
When we tell the story of Charlie Brown, we usually jump to that incredible day in 1943 when his shattered B-17 was spared by a German fighter ace in one of the most extraordinary acts of mercy in modern warfare. But to truly understand Charlie Brown, the man in the cockpit, we need to look at the years before that moment. Who was he before the war? Before that mission, before the name became part of one of the greatest stories in the honor of the skies. Charlie Lester Brown was born in 1922 in West Virginia. He grew up in the rolling hills of the Appalachians, the son of a coal miner. Like many boys of that generation, he grew up during the Great Depression. Times were hard, money was tight, but families held together with grit and faith. Charlie was bright, hardworking, and full of curiosity. He had a strong sense of duty instilled into him early. His family, though not wealthy, raised him with the values of honesty, perseverance, and responsibility. He wasn't born into privilege. Everything he achieved, he had to earn. And from a young age, he dreamed of flying. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Charlie Brown was just 19 years old. Like thousands of young men of his generation, he volunteered. he joined the U.S. Army Air Force, determined to serve his country from the sky. Candidates needed not only courage, but also intelligence, mechanical skill, and almost instinctive feel for the aircraft. Charlie worked his way through the demanding program: ground school, flight training, navigation, gunnery. In 1943, he had earned his wings and his commission as a second lieutenant. He was assigned to fly the B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the iconic heavy bombers of the war. The B-17 was called the Flying Fortress for a good reason. With 4 engines, 13 machine guns, and a reputation for toughness, it was designed to withstand brutal punishment and still bring its crew home. But it was also a dangerous assignment. Flying at high altitude, often in daylight raids deep into enemy territory, B-17 crews faced furious opposition from the German fighters and deadly flak batteries. Casualty rates were high, sometimes approaching 50%. Each B-17 carried a crew of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and gunners manning every corner of the aircraft. These were not just names on a roster. They became a family. They ate together, trained together, faced danger together. As a pilot, Charlie Brown was their captain, responsible for their lives. That responsibility weighed heavily on him. He was young, just 21, but in the skies over Europe, youth didn't matter. Leadership did. Late in 1943, Brown and his crew were sent to England. They were assigned to the 527th Bomb Squadron, 379th Bomb Group, based in Kimballton, east of London. From there, they would fly missions deep into Nazi-occupied Europe, France, the Low Countries, and Germany itself. For Charlie and his men, it was a new world: the damp English airfields, the constant roar of engines, the daily tension of the briefing rooms where targets were announced and crews steeled themselves for another mission. They knew the odds. Every time they climbed into their fortress, they faced the possibility they may not return. Charlie Brown was a fresh pilot, eager to prove himself. In December of 1943, he and his crew prepared for the very first combat mission. The target, Bremen, Germany. Bremen was a critical industrial center, filled with factories, shipyards, and military production. It was heavily defended. For a rookie crew, it was baptism by fire. Before that day, Charlie's only experience of combat was what he had been told in training. Stay in formation, trust your gunners, rely on the strength of the fortress. But he had not yet faced the black puffs of flak bursting all around, or the swarms of German fighters diving straight into the formation. That December mission to Bremen was meant to be just another run in the relentless Allied campaign to cripple Germany's war machine. For Charlie Brown, it would be the first time he led his crew into the heart of enemy territory. It's worth pausing to consider what that meant. Charlie was 21 years of age. At that age, today, many young people are just beginning college, starting their first jobs. Charlie Brown was leading 9 other men into mortal danger, commanding a machine loaded with bombs, flying into skies where death was all around. The pressure on the bomber pilots was immense. Every decision, whether to adjust altitude, whether to push through flak, whether to hold formation, could mean life or death to the entire crew. And Charlie felt that weight, but he was determined to bring his men home. On the morning of December 20th, 1943, Charlie Brown and his crew climbed into their B-17, which they had nicknamed Ye Old Pub. It was to be their first mission. Bremen, the target, the defenses, and the danger were all real. What they did not know was that the mission would test them more severely than they could have ever imagined. By the time the formation crossed into Germany, flak was exploding around them, fighters were swarming. The old pub would be hit again and again. Engines would fail, crewmen would be wounded. The bomber itself would be ripped apart. In the middle of all that chaos, with his plane nearly destroyed, Charlie Brown would face a German fighter ace named Franz Stigler, an encounter that would change both of their lives forever. Before that moment, Charlie Brown was simply a young man from West Virginia, the son of a coal miner, a newly trained pilot leading his crew into their first mission. He was untested, but he was ready. It's important to remember that behind every act of heroism or mercy in war are ordinary people. Young men like Charlie Brown, shaped by their families, their training, and the values they carry with them. That is who Charlie Brown was before the encounter, a 21-year-old American pilot carrying the weight of command, stepping into the unknown skies of Europe for the very first time.
Next up, we have the radio compartment. Now, this is an area that I knew was going to have a lot of it exposed, and so there were certain details that I wanted to make sure that I added. Additionally, the damage here I wanted to represent was an area where, in the book, it's described as a few 20mm cannon shells had entered the compartment and exploded and essentially blew out a portion of the fuselage. And so this was an area where I wanted to make sure I could represent this idea that the fuselage had been blown out and ripped apart and was just kind of, hanging onto the outside of the airframe. And so in order to achieve this, I had to remove a section of the fuselage. And so just as I described before with the Dremel, you drill it out slowly, thinning the plastic out, and then you can go ahead and cut it. And there was a few areas where the plastic was still a little on the thick side, so I wanted to make sure that I thinned that out. And because there is the top portion of the fuselage, I had to make sure that I had some corresponding damage there as well. And one of the things that I wanted to do here to represent that ripped out fuselage was using some of the black magic metal that I portrayed a little bit in the previous episode. And I really wanted to try and present this idea that, not only was the panel blown out, but, there was a lot of like shrapnel and shredded material there. And so in addition to the blown out panel, I'm trying to represent a lot of, torn up and chewed up metal. And something that I didn't mention in the first portion of this segment is when you're doing the damage, the direction that you use the knife from, whether it's from the inside of the fuselage or the outside of the fuselage, will dictate what type of damage is happening. So, for example, if I'm trying to represent a bullet impact or like the cannon impact here on this side, I'm going to use my knife from the outside and push it in. If I'm wanting to represent an explosive action from the inside pushing out, I will use the knife to cut from the inside out. And that will inform the direction that the damage is happening. And so as I was going throughout adding damage to the aircraft, I was trying to pay attention to direction, especially on things like the tail or the wings, where you have a thin section of structure and a hole on one side and a hole on the other side, where one was an entry wound essentially, and one was an exit wound. And so it was important to keep track of that and to make sure that I was trying to portray it as accurately as possible. So here I'm using some of that black magic metal to represent the skin that's been peeled back and trying to just kind of roughly cut it to shape. get it in approximately the right area. And then right now I'm going to mark out where the panel lines are. One of the nice things about this black magic metal is because of its durability, I'm actually just using the backside of a knife blade there. You can score and essentially create panel lines. Additionally, you can add rivet detail to it as well, just much as you would to plastic without it actually like punching through. I mean, I guess if you pushed hard enough, yes, you could probably get it to punch through, but it's pretty durable stuff, and it allows you to add these kinds of details so that it can, roughly match up with the plastic surface. And then what I was going to do is start, adding more jagged edges, damage, using these tweezers to really like bend and dent and manipulate the edges to make it look like this has been torn, and there's violence here, adding some additional holes in there as well. And then finally adding a little bit of that internal structure, the ribs and the stringers and things like that, just to help kind of sell the look on it. Now, what you're seeing here actually doesn't end up being the final product. I end up about halfway through, I realized I wasn't quite happy with how it was looking, and I ended up redoing that whole section, but essentially using the same process. Now, another very, very specific point of damage here is the right waist section. And in the book, it's described that some 20 millimeter cannon shells exploded in the right waist section, essentially deleting the right waist area. It says the gun was completely ripped from its mount, and massive hole there. And so this is going to be kind of one of the major focal points of the model here, because not only is it going to be damaged and you're going to be able to see inside the fuselage here, but you're going to be able to see a lot of what's happening inside the fuselage, and there's a lot of activity going on in this section of the aircraft. And so I'm going through doing my normal Dremel thing, and now I'm going to take my knife and start cutting away to represent that damage. And what was important for me here is to really kind of convey this idea that the skin of this aircraft had just been obliterated essentially, and the right waist gunner himself was actually critically injured as a result of this, and I'll describe that a little bit later on. And just to kind of point to the violence here. But what I was mentioning before about when you're adding damage to an aircraft, it's important to understand what's behind the damage that you're adding. And so one of the things here that I realized as I was going through this is by opening up this area here, there's actual windows that fit into those waist gun positions, and it varied depending on the B-17 model. Some of them were fixed in place, some of them were just you'd like pull this plexiglass panel out and set it aside. From what I can tell, this version of the B-17 had a variant of the window that would actually slide. It would slide forward, and so I had to make sure that I was representing that actual window and its mechanism for sliding inside the fuselage in its kind of in its stowed configuration, and I had to be aware that was going to be behind that damaged area. So right now I'm fitting in some of the internal structure here for the waist section, the little areas that the waist gunners would stand on. They had these wooden planks that they would stand on. There's the ammunition holders, and there's tons of different configurations of how the guns would be mounted, how the ammo would be stored. Sometimes it was attached to the wall, sometimes it was attached to the floor. There's a lot of different variants here, so you'll have to do research if you're doing something similar on what your particular subject had. From the best of my knowledge, this would be similar to what the pub would have had, the configuration that I end up with. This is that structure that I was telling you about, the mechanism that would allow these windows to slide into place and then slide open, and they could swivel the gun and point it out the window. As it wasn't always, the guns weren't always, or the gunner's position wasn't always open while the aircraft was flying, typically only when they were in the combat area. And so they had these like tracks that the window would slide on. So that's what I'm trying to represent here. And I had to do this for both sides as well. And then there's some additional armor that I'm adding here that I noticed in various reference pictures for the gunners, and get that installed in there. And here's where, as from what I can see, the ammunition would have been stored in this configuration and would have fed to the gun on the left side for the left waist, and then on the right side for the right waist. Additionally, there was some more armor plating that would have gone just below the window, and so I've got to make sure I get that represented here, so that the gunners needed a little bit of protection. It wouldn't have been much, but something's better than nothing. And get this the structure here for where the gun would attach to the actual window mount itself. So it's basically like a window sill, in essence, going on here, and that eventually connects up to the gun mount itself, which you'll see it a little bit later on. So I'm removing the mount from the kit part, and I put this little bracket on, and then you can see the hole there in that little semicircular piece. So the gun mount will drop into that hole and then will attach up to that bracket. Now again, there's many different configurations, so this isn't necessarily going to be the correct configuration for all B-17Fs, but it's what I gravitated towards and what looked good to me. So as I mentioned, they had these sliding windows, and when I was doing the damage, I initially didn't realize that I had a bullet hole that would be right where the window would be stowed. So I had to add some damage to the window to line up with that that damage on the outside. And this is one of those details that is not visible on the finished model, but I know it's there. Now it's there, and it's something that I like. We're going to be moving into a section here that's kind of an interesting section for me to talk about, and that's the crew. So as I was contemplating doing this project, one of the things that I wrestled with internally was how best to represent the crew. Now, I often add figures to my model kits. I like adding figures to my model kit. It adds a sense of scale. It adds a sense of life to a model. But this was really one of the first times that I was representing actual people that have names. And in addition to that, I had to figure out how I wanted to represent death and injury to these people. As I mentioned before, the right waist gunner was severely injured. In fact, his left leg was pretty much severed below the knee, and he ends up surviving, but it's very critical. The tail gunner, he was killed rather quickly by some 20 millimeter cannon fire, and I really and it was very violent. And I really struggled with how I was going to depict that. And I kind of had two schools of thoughts here. One was, I wanted to be accurate and represent everything as accurate as I could to the event. But also understanding that would require depicting some rather violent death on my model. And knowing that, I would be putting this out on YouTube, that I have young viewers who watch my channel, and I try to maintain a rather family-friendly channel, in spite of the overall military-themed subject matter that I do, and also that it was my intention to bring this to shows and whatnot, and how to find that balance between not making it overly gratuitous, but at the same time realizing that these were real people. They really died. They were really injured, and that their story, deserved to be told. And I think it deserved to be told accurate. And in fact, I wrestled with this so much that I ended up calling my brother, who's an Air Force veteran. I talked to my nephew, who's a Navy veteran, and talked to a few other people to get their opinions on how best to do this. And ultimately, I decided that it was going to be, in my opinion, the best way to honor these men was to do it as accurately as possible, and that meant it's going to have a level of violence to it. Now, you're not going to see that in this episode. That's a lot of that's going to be covered in the next episode, but it was important to me to make sure that I was getting this done correctly and accurately, and trying to really, capture this moment in time of this terrified crew. And in the end, I'm quite pleased with the work that I did on the crew. They're not perfect. They're not going to be super accurate. They're not going to have all the right equipment and uniforms and everything, but I think that the story that they convey will be accurate. So moving on now to the wings of the aircraft, there was a lot of significant damage that I needed to portray, and what's interesting is there's a very specific portion of damage that's called out in the book, where the crew and eventually the ground crew on the ground understand that there's a hole in the wing that was the perfect size for an 88 millimeter flak shell, or flak round, and what they believe is the flak round essentially it was a direct hit. It hit the aircraft, passed straight through the wing, but didn't detonate. And so that, things like that is like, okay, I want to make sure that I want to call that out. The engines were heavily damaged. The number 2 engine, at the time that I'm portraying the aircraft, was shut down, and it was damaged by flak pretty early in the mission, early in the bomb raid. The number 3 and 4 engines were damaged and were not running at full power, and so they estimate that the aircraft was probably only flying on about 60% power by the time that Franz Stigler came up to them. The number 1 engine was pretty much the only engine that was relatively undamaged. And another thing about the wings of the aircraft is there's a lot of internal structure that you have to be aware of when you're doing damage, and just note that you'll want to represent things. So here's my interpretation of what the number 2 damage looks like. This engine, like I said, was shut down and it was not running, and so I wanted to make sure there was a fair amount of damage there. One thing about the HK kit here is that it represents the cowl flaps in an open position, and in flight, at altitude, cruising, or even with a shutdown engine, the cowl flaps would have been closed in order to maintain aerodynamic airflow over the engine nacelle. And so I had to go through and modify all of the cowl flaps, and it essentially just boils down to me just bending each cowl flap so that it's closer conformed to the body, or to the nacelle, so that it's a little bit more accurate there. I looked online to see if there was any kind of replacement part for it, and I contemplated just like cutting all the cowl flaps off and then replacing them with plastic, but in the end, bending them, I think it gave me the result that I was looking for. And and so I'm probably adding more damage to this engine nacelle than would have actually happened, but in order to convey the story that I was trying to tell, I really wanted to make sure that it was understood that this engine was knocked out and out of commission. But also I wanted to open up some of that engine cowling to expose the phenomenally 3D printed engines that I got from Matters of Scale. I'm going to put a link down to their website down below, but the 3D printed engines they have are essentially a drop-in replacement to the kit parts and just a massive improvement over what the kit offers. And so another thing that's very distinctly pointed out in terms of damage to the aircraft is the fact that the left horizontal stabilizer was pretty much gone. The way that it's described in the book is there was only about 4 feet of stabilizer left attached to the aircraft. The rest of it was just gone. It was just a nice clean shear break. And so this was a pretty easy modification to make, just in terms of I just have to cut off most of the the horizontal stabilizer, I also decided to completely remove the rest of the elevator as well. But now this leaves me with a rather large opening that would have internal structure. So I whipped up some parts on my computer and 3D printed some structure here that I could, essentially mix and match to build out some structure here. I did have to do a significant amount of thinning of the plastic to better represent the thin nature of the actual aircraft, and to get the 3D parts to fit in there. But I was eventually able to get there and start able to add in some of the structure, the spar, things like that, and create some cool look to the inside of this. Now, what you'll end up seeing here differs slightly from the final result. Much like the panel in the radio room, I end up making some changes later on in the build. But again, it gives you an idea of what I'm going for. And we're going to be using the black magic metal here again to represent kind of the torn edges of the metal here. And again, this is just such a great versatile material. I'll leave a link down to this below as well, where you can find it and support Gets Mini for this phenomenal product. But yeah, we're just going to go ahead and glue this on. And just like on the radio operator area, I was able to kind of do some scoring to represent the panel lines and riveting, just to kind of help it match up. Now, it's not going to be a complete one-to-one match, but it's close enough for me. And again, we're going to go ahead and kind of damage up the very edge here, add some torn edges, jagged edges, and really give this the impression that the metal has been ripped away and torn away. It's not necessarily explained what damages the tail, or not the tail, sorry, the horizontal stabilizer. It's unclear if it's flak, if it's cannon fire from fighters. It's just described that it's there one moment and gone the next. And adding a little bit of some puncture marks here. And then finally doing some little bit of internal structure that'll, kind of help sell the idea that that there was internal structure here to this portion. The final bit here that I was trying to figure out how I wanted to represent was the rubber de-icing boot that would be on the leading edge there, and I ended up just using some thin plastic to represent that. It also helped me eliminate having to sand and fill in that seam. Now, returning to the rudder that we previously looked at, I ended up deciding that I wanted to do way more damage than I'd originally planned. And in order to do that, in order to represent the fabric covered structure here, I ended up designing and 3D printing the internal structure for the rudder. And this took some trial and error, and I'm not the greatest at modeling 3D, so it's really pretty basic. And if you look close enough, you can kind of see where I had to, fudge some details. But what I'm going to end up doing is covering it in the black magic metal and then tearing it and shredding it to really give the appearance that the rudder had been legitimately shredded. Now, either by cannon fire, machine gun fire, or flak. We'll leave that up to the imagination of the viewer. But I really wanted, and another thing that was kind of impressed in my mind that I wanted to represent was the idea that this fabric was ripped and torn and blowing in the airflow of the aircraft, and that was kind of important for me to represent here. So starting off, and you'll see that I actually attached the 3D printed part to the front portion of the rudder, which would have been metal from the kit part, and it was just the back half of the rudder was actually fabric covered. So now we're going to go ahead and add the black magic metal on, and essentially what I'm just going to do is cover both sides of it, trim it down to size, and then I'll go through and start the shredding process, which was quite fun and kind of cathartic to do. Another thing, you'll notice kind of that notch cut out at the back of the rudder. That's where the trim tab would be. I decided that I was just going to have the trim tab just was completely removed and damaged enough that it's gone. So yeah, at this point, this is going to start wrapping up this portion of the model. Part 3 will be coming out next week, and that'll be the painting process and the weathering and kind of the final stages of this build. So if you've made it this far throughout the video, I know this is a long video, but I appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting this channel. I would like to give a big shout out to my patrons for helping to support the channel and allowing me to bring this kind of content to you. If you're liking the video series, go ahead and hit subscribe and like the video. Tell me what you think down below. Tell me your thoughts. I'd love to hear back from you guys. And we're going to finish off this video with some final pictures of all the work that we've done up to this point. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.